November 1944, a forward aid station near Metz, France. Mud clings to the canvas walls of a heavy tent. Rain beats a steady rhythm against the roof. Inside, the air smells of wet wool, copper, and iodine. Soldiers lie on canvas cots, their boots stained with European clay. One man turns his head toward the door, his breathing shallow, his fingers gripping a silver medal around his neck. He asks for something he cannot have. He asks for a priest to hear his final confession. The request ripples through the room, met only by the sound of falling rain and a broken field radio. The man needs the sacraments, but the distance between his soul and his church is widening by the minute. A four-star general is driving toward this exact tent, carrying a response that no one in the room expects. This is the story of what General George S. Patton did when a dying soldier asked for a priest, and there was no priest available in the mud of France. Before we continue, make sure you subscribe to our channel. We tell the World War II stories that show the human being inside the uniform. Private First Class Thomas Callahan was only 20 years old. He came from South Boston, Massachusetts, where the Atlantic breeze smelled of salt, and the church bells rang every single morning. He grew up in a tight apartment filled with the scent of boiled wool and heavy stews, the youngest son of an Irish dockworker who taught him to keep his mouth shut and his chin up. He enlisted because his older brothers had gone, and because the parish priest had blessed them all from the altar. Before he crossed the ocean, his mother hung a heavy silver St. Christopher medal around his neck, warning him never to unloose the clasp. He carried that weight through the hedgerows and the mud, a boy who went to Mass every Sunday of his life and believed in the absolute reality of heaven and hell. Now he lay paralyzed on a canvas cot in a dark tent, a piece of jagged shrapnel having torn through his stomach, leaving him to watch his own life pool on the wooden floorboards. The second man in the room was not an enemy soldier, but a force of absolute separation. His name was Captain Arthur Vance, a 34-year-old physician from the wealthy suburbs of Hartford, Connecticut, serving with the Regional Medical Evacuation Detachment. Vance believed entirely in the clean machinery of modern medicine and the absolute authority of the triage board. He kept his boots shined to a high mirror glaze, despite the swamp of the French winter, and he wore a tailored wool officer coat that had never seen the inside of a frontline trench. To Vance, a casualty was a logistical unit, a problem of supply and time rather than a soul in transit. He stood by the small iron stove in the center of the tent, holding a warm porcelain mug of black coffee, completely removed from the wet reality of the dying boys around him. He looked down at his charts, indifferent to the spiritual terror of the young private from South Boston. The rain over the Moselle River did not stop for 3 weeks. By November 1944, the Third Army was locked in a brutal wrestle for the fortress city of Metz, a place surrounded by ancient stone bastions and thick belts of barbed wire. The German defense was stubborn, digging into concrete bunkers that had resisted artillery fire for months. The autumn mud had turned the roads into rivers of cold, gray soup, stalling supply trucks and swallowing heavy tanks up to their axles. Because the advance was so slow, divisional medical stations were forced to operate much closer to the artillery line than regulations ever allowed. They were overcrowded, understaffed, and constantly shivering. In the chaos of that wet autumn, the normal chain of command became frayed. Divisional commanders were focused entirely on the consumption of gasoline and the daily expenditure of high explosive shells. The spiritual and psychological needs of the infantrymen were frequently treated as secondary concerns, luxuries for a civilian world that no longer existed. Other high-ranking officers routinely ignored the complaints of field doctors, who warned that their men were breaking under the constant weight of cold and fear. If a field telephone line went dead, it stayed dead until a replacement squad found the time to splice the copper. If a unit chaplain was caught on the wrong side of an artillery barrage 3 miles away, the wounded simply waited in silence. It was an environment where efficiency was measured strictly in numbers, and the individual soldier was easily reduced to a name on a casualty report. That cold reality was exactly what filled the dark tent when the young private from South Boston looked up from his blood-soaked blanket and caught the eye of the medical officer standing by the stove. The young private raised his left hand slightly, his fingers trembling as they brushed the silver metal, resting on his blood-soaked shirt. He spoke through split lips, his voice barely rising above the whistle of the wind outside the canvas door. "Please, doctor," he said, "get the priest." Captain Vance did not look up from his metal clipboard, his fountain pen making a sharp clicking sound as he capped it. "The chaplain is not here, Private," Vance said. The boy turned his head toward the iron stove, his eyes wide and dark with a desperate panic that had nothing to do with physical pain. "I need the final prayers, doctor," the boy said. "I need the confession before it gets dark." Vance picked up his porcelain mug, taking a slow sip of coffee before pointing the rim toward the wet canvas wall. "The divisional chaplain is currently tending to the 3rd Battalion," Vance said, "and that is exactly 3 miles down a road that is currently under direct German mortar fire." The Army corpsman, standing at the foot of the cot, stepped forward, his knuckles white against the wooden frame. "Sir, the private has a deep abdominal wound and significant internal bleeding," the corpsman said, "and his vitals are dropping by the minute. Then you will continue to monitor his dressing and keep him comfortable," Vance replied. The corpsman leaned closer to the doctor, lowering his voice so the other wounded men on the cots could not hear. "He does not have an hour, sir, and he is a Catholic boy from South Boston who just wants his rights," the corpsman whispered. Vance set his coffee down on the small wooden table with a sharp thud, his eyes narrowing as he looked at the medic. "We are running a medical evacuation station, Sergeant, not a parish church in New England," Vance said. "But the radio line is completely dead, sir, and we could send a jeep driver to bring him back." The corpsman said, "I am not risking a working vehicle and a driver on a muddy road for a ritual," Vance said. The private groaned, his grip tightening around the St. Christopher medal until his knuckles turned completely gray. "Please, someone," the boy whispered. "The prayers." Vance picked up his clipboard again, turned his back on the private, and walked toward the dry section of the tent near the supply crates. "He is a logistical casualty now, Sergeant, and my priority is the men we can actually save and return to the line," Vance said. The corpsman stared at the doctor for a long moment, then turned and walked out into the heavy rain toward the main command tent down the road. The report concerning the medical officer and the dying private reached the 3rd Army headquarters within 45 minutes. Patton arrived within the hour. His open-top jeep pulled directly through the deep mire, up to the front entrance of the canvas hospital ward, its tires splashing heavy gray water against the tent lines. The general stepped out unannounced, wearing his winter wool service uniform with 4 silver stars gleaming sharply under the dim sky, his ivory-handled revolvers resting in their dark leather holsters on his waist. Every man inside the tent immediately noticed the sudden change in pressure as the canvas flap opened, letting in a blast of freezing wind. The general walked straight past the rows of wooden cots, his face set like cold stone, his polished leather boots tracking wet clay along the wooden floorboards. He stopped at the foot of the cot, where the boy from South Boston lay shaking. Patton studied the medical officer for a brief moment. He looked down at the charts, then at the doctor. "Are you the officer in charge of this triage ward?" Patton asked. "Yes, General, I am Captain Vance," the doctor replied, coming to a stiff salute. "Did this soldier ask you for a chaplain to receive his final sacraments?" Patton asked. "He did, sir, but the regional chaplain is located 3 miles away, and the main road is currently under heavy interdiction fire," Vance answered. "And you refused to send a driver or clear a line for him because of the distance?" Patton asked. "I did, sir, because a jeep would be lost to enemy mortars, and we cannot risk material assets for individual rituals when we have live casualties to evacuate," Vance said. Patton looked down at the private, whose hand was still weakly gripping the silver medal on his neck. The general turned back to the medical captain, his voice dropping to a low, icy level that carried clearly to every corner of the crowded tent. "You stand here in a dry coat with a warm mug of coffee, telling me what you cannot risk for an American soldier who has given everything he possesses to this army," Patton said. "You see a number on a ledger, a piece of broken machinery to be cleared away when your charts are complete. But I see a man who has kept his oath to his nation and his God, a boy who went into the fire because his country demanded it, and who now faces the greatest terror a human soul can know without the simple comfort of his faith. You believe your rank separates you from the spiritual duties of this command, but a leader who cannot feel the pain of his men is entirely unfit to wear the uniform of the United States. Patton continued, "This soldier did not ask you for medicine or a miracle. He asked for his prayers. If our chaplains cannot cross those 3 miles of mud, then someone in this tent will stand in their place, because no man under my command will die like a dog in the dark without the words of God in his ears. You have a choice right now, Captain. You will either drop to your knees and repeat the sacred words of contrition with this private, or you will pack your gear and prepare to spend the rest of this winter digging graves in the frozen mud of Metz alongside the registration squads. Decide now." Captain Vance looked at the general, his face turning completely pale as he realized the choice before him, his hands shaking as he slowly lowered his clipboard onto the table and remained silent. Patton walked slowly to the edge of the cot and looked down at Private Callahan. The general reached out with his right hand and took the young soldier's cold, damp fingers into his own palm. "I am not a priest, son," Patton said, "but I know the prayers if you will have me." The boy from South Boston blinked through the damp haze of the tent, his pale face relaxing slightly as he nodded his head. The general knelt down in the wet clay beside the wooden frame, closed his eyes, and began to speak from memory. "Oh my God, I am heartily sorry for having offended thee," Patton whispered, pausing for a brief moment after every single line to let the private repeat the holy words. The young soldier mouthed the sentences through dry lips, his weak grip tightening around the general's hand as the prayer continued. Patton moved smoothly into the Our Father and then recited the Hail Mary, his low voice steady against the roar of the rain outside. He concluded with a short, quiet prayer of his own, asking that the boy be received into heaven with full honors for his courage. The young private's breathing slowed down, his heavy eyelids closed, and his fingers loosened their grip on the general's hand as his soul departed. Patton sat in absolute silence beside the body for 2 minutes, then stood up, crossed himself, and walked out into the storm without a word. Private First Class Thomas Callahan never made it back to South Boston. His remains were buried under a white cross in the United States Military Cemetery outside Metz, before being returned to his family in Massachusetts during the summer of 1948. His mother kept the silver St. Christopher medal in a small, wooden velvet box on her dresser, never knowing that a 4-star general had held her youngest son's hand as he repeated his final prayers in the dark. The family simply knew that Thomas had died in the grace of his church, a small scrap of comfort that sustained his mother until her own passing in 1964. Captain Arthur Vance was removed from his position as medical chief of the regional evacuation station within 24 hours of the incident. He was reassigned to a rear echelon logistics depot near Cherbourg, where he spent the remainder of the European conflict counting crates of blankets and monitoring rations. He returned to Connecticut in 1946, building a highly successful private medical practice, but refusing to ever speak about his time in France. He lived in absolute silence regarding the war until his death in 1979, leaving behind journals that never once mentioned the name of George Patton or the tent near Metz. General Patton never recorded the event in his official diaries, nor did he include it in his personal letters to his wife. The story remained entirely within the memories of the wounded men and the corpsmen who sat in the canvas ward that rainy November afternoon. Years later, an aide found a small handwritten note in the back of an old prayer book inside the general's desk. The note simply stated that a commander must always be prepared to fulfill the spiritual ledger of his men, because the soul of an American soldier belongs to God alone. Some historians have argued that General Patton's actions in the forward aid station were a direct violation of standard military protocol, claiming that a field commander has no authority to assume the spiritual duties of an ordained clergyman. These critics suggest that his intervention was an emotional overreach that risked undermining the official role of the chaplain corps during a critical phase of the European campaign. Other historians have argued the opposite, insisting that his decision represented the highest form of battlefield leadership, proving that a true commander is responsible for the complete well-being of his men. What is certain is that the event left an permanent mark on the witnesses in that tent, demonstrating that even under the absolute pressure of mechanized warfare, a simple act of shared faith could completely shatter the rigid boundaries of military rank. If you had been in General Patton's position inside that rainy tent, would you have knelt down to recite those final prayers yourself? Or would you have chosen a softer alternative by quietly comforting the soldier while waiting for the official chain of command to resolve the situation? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you want to discover more forgotten stories that reveal the true human being inside the uniform, make sure to subscribe to our channel right now.